Hey guys, so I recently saw a post on Facebook saying white people can't be called racist for owning slaves because ethnic Jews owned more slaves than white people did. And it's like only 3% of white people own slaves and 15% of ethnic Jews own slaves, but nobody talks about this fact. That smelled like anti-Semitism to me, but the numbers piqued my interest. So I looked into it. Jews did in fact own slaves, but the numbers in that meme were way off. So, according to History Channel, around 32% of white families owned slaves, average across the country. Jacob Rader Marcus, a historian and rabbi, wrote in the History of American Jews that nearly 40% of Jewish families across the country owned slaves. So, not that much of a difference in terms of percentage. In major southern cities such as Charleston, South Carolina, which was the largest Jewish community in the United States at the time, as well as in Richmond, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia, more than 75% of Jewish citizens owned slaves. Owning slaves was apparently seen as a status thing, like of showing that you had wealth. Judaism's religious texts, the Tanakh, Talmud, and Torah, I apologize for any mispronunciations. I am not Jewish. I'm just trying my best here. So all of Judaism's religious texts contain laws governing the ownership and treatment of slaves. The laws include punishment for slave owners who mistreat their slaves. During the abolition movement, some Jews and also Christians used their religious texts to argue slavery was their religious right. These are indeed facts. Where facts verge into anti-Semitism is when people claim that Jews were the driving force behind the Atlantic slave trade, as is claimed in Tony Martin's book, The Jewish Onslaught. Some black Christian scholars claim Jews invented anti-black prejudices through the story of the curse of Ham, or Ham, where Noah curses Ham's son Canaan to perpetual slavery. Modern scholars do not accept these conclusions and see the claims as anti-Semitic. Jonathan Schorsch, author of Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World, says the Jewish source of the curse on Ham remains an invention of 20th century Christian polemicists. T. David Kerp, professor of history at Ohio University, says Christians and even some Muslims eventually identified Ham's descendants as black Africans and used this as justification for slavery. So it wasn't even Jews who did that. Don't blame them for what we did. The big voices behind the Jews own the most slave claims are David Duke, a former KKK Grand Wizard, and the Nation of Islam, an African-American political and religious movement based on black supremacy and anti-Semitism. As a side note, both of these groups are classified as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center due to the violence and hateful rhetoric of their members. The Nation of Islam released an entire book about the whole Jews own the most slaves concept in 1991 called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. The thesis of this book is that slavery was masterminded by the Jews and uses the most tenuous of correlations to back up their ideas. One of their arguments that Jews were financially backing the slave trade is based on the fact that most Jews in America were Sephardic Jews, originally from Portugal and Spain, that the industries they were in were the textile industry, which relied on cotton, and the Portuguese were the first to engage in selling African slaves to the Americas. Therefore, the Jews must be behind it all. I mean, obviously. But this completely ignores the 1946 Jewish expulsion order by Portuguese King Manuel I that kickstarted a massive immigration movement. So Jews were not in Portugal when the whole slave trade thing started. Stop blaming them for stuff they didn't do. Slavery is bad enough without placing blame where it doesn't belong. Critics of the secret relationship between blacks and Jews point out that it uses selective citations to intentionally exaggerate the roles Jews played in slavery. Henry Louis Gates Jr., head of the Department of Afro-American Studies at Harvard, called the secret relationship the Bible of New Anti-Semitism, and he went on to say the book massively misinterprets the historical record. Volume 2 of The Secret Relationship, How Jews Gained Control of the Black American Economy, was published in 2010. The Anti-Defamation League said this volume blames Jews for promoting a myth of black racial inferiority and makes a range of conspiratorial accusations about Jewish involvement in the slave trade and in the cotton, textiles, and banking industries. But did the Nation of Islam stop there? Of course not. Volume 3, Leo Frank, The Lynching of a Guilty Man, came out in 2016. claims that early 20th century businessmen worked to subjugate black people and were behind the rebirth of the KKK, which makes no sense because the KKK is anti-Semitic. The book also alleges that the Jews are responsible for the lynching of Leo Frank. I'm not really sure what their logic is with this one, because Leo Frank was Jewish and was highly involved in his ethnic and religious community. He was even the president of multiple Jewish organizations. Like, why would Jewish people lynch one of their own champions? He worked to help smooth the very tense Jewish and non-Jewish relations that were going on at the time. Like, why would they lynch him? I'll tell you why they lynched him. Not the Jews, but why he was lynched. Frank was convicted of the murder of Mary Fagan, a child laborer at a Jewish-owned factory in 1913, and was sentenced to death. Georgia State Governor John M. Slaton, or Slaton, I'm not sure, commuted his sentence to life in prison. So he's not going to die. He's just going to spend the rest of his life in prison. And a mob was furious. They broke into the prison and lynched Frank. Like I said, tensions between Jews and other whites in the area were especially high at this time, based on fear of Jewish immigrants that they were going to take over. The lynch mob was almost certainly made up of non-Jewish white people. Nation of Islam has devolved more and more into nonsense with their anti-Semitic crusade, regardless of what they're trying to claim as fact. However, even when the statistics aren't cherry-picked, facts are meaningless without context. Sure, up to 75% of Jews owned slaves, but Jews did not have a major impact on the slave trade. They possessed far fewer slaves in terms of total numbers than non-Jews did. You can't base statistics like that off of percentages of the population that owned slaves. That's like when anti-vaxxers try to say that vaccinated people get sick more often because 70% of measles cases happen in vaccinated people. That ignored the fact that there were 19 cases of measles among the 2,056 vaccinated people in the study, compared to 8 cases among the 41 unvaccinated people. So 1% of the vaccinated people got measles and 20% of the unvaccinated got measles. But I digress. Let's apply this analogy to Jews and slaves. Jews purchased slaves at a rate proportional to the general population. 32% of non-Jewish white people, 40% of Jewish. Jonathan Schorsch, the guy that wrote the relationship between, what was that book called again? Hang on, I had it written down here. Not The Secret Relationship, anti-Semitic one. Here it is. Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World. So he says that Jews' treatment of their slaves closely resembled that of their host populations and was lacking in Jewish particularities. So they were acting just like the white people that weren't Jewish. They weren't doing anything different. Jason H. Silverman, a slavery historian, describes Jewish contribution to the slave trade as minuscule and says that if there had been no Jews living in North America at all, the rise and fall of the slave trade would have been no different. Less than 250,000 Jewish people lived in North America at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. Less than 2% of slaves were owned by Jews. In fact, in 1860, 1/4 of all slaves were owned by an elite 2.8% of white Americans, which kind of sounds like the wealth hoarding and systemic oppression that still exists today. But that's another story for another day. We're talking about slavery. Slavery is a horrific scar on our history, and it is important to talk about its lasting impact. But making false claims to suit your narrative doesn't help anyone. Slavery was horrible, and it wasn't just Jews making it that way. Perhaps a more constructive discussion would be how to repair the damage that slavery has caused and is still causing, so that we can move forward into a future that is more equitable for everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sources that I used researching this topic were myjewishlearning.com, The Atlantic, Wikipedia, History.com, PolitiFact, TheConservation.com, YesMagazine.org, digitalhistory.uh.edu, Chabad.org, Jewish Virtual Library, OU.org, Washington Post, National Institute of Health, and Southern Poverty Law Center. Please hit the thumbs up button if you like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Bye!